Have you ever heard of the Zogby Initiative, but you didn't really know what it was? Well, you're in luck. In this interview with Father Deacon Anthony Dragani, he and I discussed the Zogby Initiative, what it is, the good, the bad of the Zogby Initiative, and also whether or not it is an effective means to bring about union with the Eastern Orthodox. Check it out. And we're talking today about the Zogby Initiative, which is something that came out of Archbishop Elias Zoghby, Melkite Archbishop. And, this is something that we've been seeing a lot of, at least in Eastern Catholic circles. I certainly see it pretty often. And, I actually had a request the other day for, somebody asked, why don't you do a show on this? And I said, yeah, I've actually been thinking about that for a while. And Father Dragani and I have it planned. So here we are. Father Dragani, well, first, let me welcome you back to the show. How are you?
Fantastic. Great being here, Michael.
Always a pleasure to have you on. I'm excited about this. This is one that really we've been, wanting to touch on for a while here. So I'm glad we have the opportunity to do it. Can you maybe start us out with just some basics of who exactly, Archbishop Zogby was before we dive into the Zogby Initiative and questions?
Yes. So to understand the initiative, you have to understand the Archbishop himself. Mm-hmm. His background really kind of shaped this. So he was born and raised in Egypt. And he came from a background that was not that uncommon among Christians in the Middle East, in that his mother was Melkite Greek Catholic, for those who aren't familiar, one of the Eastern Catholic churches, and his father was Antiochian Orthodox. So it came from a situation where the mother was Catholic, the father was Orthodox. Among Christians in the Middle East, that kind of situation is very, very common. And growing up, his family went to a Melkite church because it was the closest one. It was very convenient to get to. If there was an Antiochian Orthodox church closer, they might have gone there. Because in the Middle East, in places where Christians are persecuted, well, the separations between Catholic and Orthodox don't mean quite as much. They're not as significant because in their day-to-day experience, they're all followers of Christ facing persecution from an outside religion. So he grew up in a mixed marriage, but his whole family went to the Melkite church, and they were very devout. They would pray the divine office together as a family on a daily basis, or at least portions of it. They'd go to divine liturgy regularly every Sunday. They'd go to Vespers at the church on Saturday evenings, very involved. And his father would pray every day that one of his sons became a priest. And, Archbishop Elias became by vocation. So he went to study in Jerusalem at a seminary in Jerusalem. And while he was there, he also experienced, the situation in Israel, which was a little bit different than in Egypt. But again, Christians were a minority and they faced a certain level of persecution. He then returned to Egypt, became a parish priest, eventually became a bishop, and ultimately an archbishop in Egypt. For a period of time, he was the leader of the Melkite Church in Egypt. And during that period, the government was becoming increasingly Islamic. What I mean by that was, for a period of time when he was growing up, Christians had more rights. But during the period in which he was a bishop at first, the government was enacting more and more Sharia laws, and Christians were becoming increasingly persecuted. And he took a strong stance against this. He was not going to tolerate it. And he issued protests. He stood firm against the government and ended up being arrested and imprisoned for a period of time. He was eventually released from prison. And shortly thereafter, the Second Vatican Council began. And he went to the Second Vatican Council and he accompanied the Melkite Patriarch, Maximus. At the council, Archbishop Elias became a very prominent Eastern Catholic voice. The Melkites had a tremendous impact on shaping the council. And Archbishop Elias is one of the most active of the Melkite bishops there. As a matter of fact, he had 11 interventions, which is pretty high for a bishop of the council. And he had a lot of impact on both the decree on ecumenism. Also, he had a huge impact on the decree on the Eastern Catholic churches. So he helped shape some of the documents of Vatican II. And during that period, he really caught the attention of Pope Paul VI, who was very impressed with him. He thought he was a pretty remarkable man. The Catholic media during that period, though, didn't know what to make of him because he was very intimidating. When he was set on something, he focused like a laser beam, and he brought a certain intensity with him. So some members of the Catholic media during the Second Vatican Council called him Bomb because he was known. You hear me okay, Michael?
The last part started to cut out for me. Can you repeat the last sentence?
Sure, I was getting some lag on my camera.
Yeah, I don't know what was going on. Just repeat the last sentence.
Okay. So during the Second Vatican Council, some members of the Catholic media called him the Bomb.
Okay.
Because he was known for being very intense, very determined, and intimidating. But it came from a place of love, ultimately. Love for the church, love for Christ. But he was very intense in his love for Christ. So at the Second Vatican Council, as you're well aware, tremendous strides were made towards reuniting the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Patriarch Athenagoras and Pope Paul VI officially consigned the anathemas of 1054 to oblivion. And it looked to a lot of people like reunion between the Catholic and Orthodox was right around the corner. It seemed to be almost imminent, moving at warp speed. That's how it was during the Second Vatican Council. But when the council was over, he went back to Egypt, and eventually he was sent to be a bishop then in Lebanon. And in Lebanon, Archbishop Elias caught the attention of Islamic radicals from Iran who actually kidnapped him. And these terrorists held him as a hostage for a period of time until his release was eventually secured. So, during his life, he was both a prisoner of the Egyptian government and a prisoner of Iranian terrorists. Again, a situation that we as Christians here in North America could never imagine. So he really suffered for his faith. And like all of the Christians of the region, he was persecuted.
Yeah.
But again, when you're facing persecution, when you are suffering at the hands of a foreign religion, the differences between Christians become less and less significant in the eyes of the Christians. So on the ground level, one thing that was very common, both in Lebanon and Egypt, was that Orthodox and Catholic Christians would go to each other's churches and receive communion, even worship together, and nobody thought too much of it. No one really batted an eye because they were just so used to living together in this persecuted situation that the differences seemed insignificant. But during his time at the Second Vatican Council and afterward, Archbishop Elias was troubled by something. He recognized that among the leadership of the churches, both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches, that there was complacency, that both sides were comfortable with the schism. They were comfortable with the status quo. And the hope that he had at Vatican II that the schism may end shortly didn't materialize. It seemed stuck. Yeah, there were dialogues started, but the dialogue seemed to go around in circles and the progress just wasn't being made. So at that point, he decided he was going to do something rather radical, rather shocking even, to try and force things forward. He was going to try a maneuver that he knew probably wouldn't succeed, but at the very least, it might shock people out of their complacency. So I'm going to pause right there.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's nice to hear. It's interesting to hear his background, his dedication to Christ, and all of that I appreciate. I want to touch on his perspectives and his initiative, especially here in a moment. But did you have anything else you wanted to add about his biography before we maybe shift to the initiative itself?
Well, he was very controversial in both the Catholic and the Orthodox churches. And he kind of wanted to be, because again, he saw himself as having a vocation of uniting the churches. And he thought that shock was one of the ways of doing that, at least getting people out of their complacency.
I can certainly appreciate getting people out of their complacency, especially in this area. I kind of feel like we need a little bit more of that. It certainly seems like both sides are pretty content to keep the status quo, as you mentioned there. And I certainly don't see a reunion around the corner anytime soon, not when I look at the situation. And that's unfortunate. I wish that weren't the case. But yeah, so let's maybe touch on the initiative itself. What exactly is the Zogby Initiative? Can you maybe summarize that for us?
Yeah. So at the heart of it is a notion called double communion, in which a church can be in communion with two bodies simultaneously, two larger bodies. So when we talk about church, we're talking about, in Catholicism, there are 24 churches that together make up the Catholic Church. We've talked about this before, but for those who aren't familiar with it, the Catholic Church is really a communion of 24 churches, the largest of which is the Latin Church, otherwise known as the Roman Catholic Church, but there are also 23 Eastern Catholic churches. And the Melkite Church, his church, grew out of the Antiochian tradition. And relatively late in the 18th century, there was a split in the Antiochian Orthodox Patriarchate, where a sizable portion became Eastern Catholic and the other portion remained Eastern Orthodox. So in the history of schisms, this was one of the latest ones. And again, he came from this, right? His father was Antiochian Orthodox, his mother was Melkite. So what he witnessed, though, in person was, Orthodox going to his Melkite church and receiving communion, and Melkites going to the Orthodox church and receiving communion. And he came to think, well, couldn't this happen on a wider scale? And he began studying history, and he realized that throughout the first millennium, it was not uncommon for churches to be in communion with other bodies that weren't in communion with each other. In other words, there are periods of time where, say, the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Rome were not united. For whatever reason, they had broken communion between them, but maybe the Patriarch of Alexandria was in communion with both. That kind of situation was pretty common during the first millennium. It happened quite a bit, where there'd be, heresies and struggles, and one, patriarchate would be in communion with both. One might be only in communion with the other. But it wasn't something strange. No one batted an eye at it back then. So he thought, well, this is happening on a practical level already. Already, the Melkites and the Antiochian Orthodox from the same tradition are already sharing communion. So why can't we do this on the wider scale? So his proposal was this: the Melkite Church would remain in full communion with Rome, but at the same time be in communion with the Antiochian Orthodox. So it would be in communion with both the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church through those particular connections. That was his goal. Now, again, he recognized there'd be opposition to this, and he thought on some level it probably couldn't happen, but he thought this proposal, if nothing else, would get people talking and get people considering how we can move past the current juncture.
Well, pointing to early church precedent, I kind of feel like in the early church, one of the reasons why you might have a situation like that is because information did not travel as effectively. So, you might have a situation where when local church is in communion with others, whereas those churches actually aren't in communion with each other. And so I could see that happening in an age where information travels very slowly. But I don't know if I could see that today, where we can access information pretty quickly.
Yeah, during the first millennium, information did flow much more slowly, and that was part of it. But there undoubtedly were situations in which a see was in communion with both and knew that there was a schism, but maintained communion with both. Situations like that did exist, and again, it wasn't seen as being particularly unusual. But back then, the dominant ecclesiology was what's called communion ecclesiology, in which the church was a communion of smaller churches that were united together through communion. And at Vatican II, there was a real attempt to bring that ecclesiology back. As a matter of fact, in Lumen Gentium, we see it pretty much enshrined, in Catholic teaching. So if communion ecclesiology was once again becoming the dominant ecclesiology of the Catholic Church, like it was throughout the first 1,000 years, maybe we could restore the practices of a communion ecclesiology.
But this communion ecclesiology wouldn't be antithetical or opposed to communion with the Bishop of Rome being essential.
No, definitely not. I mean, it's in Lumen Gentium. It's right there in Lumen Gentium.
Yeah, you can see both of those things in that document. I agree. So, I mean, tell us a little bit more about what he decided to do after he kind of presented this idea of the Zogby Initiative. What did he do himself?
So he first began kind of seeding the idea, putting it out there in the 1970s. But again, decades passed, nothing happened. So in 1995, he decided to basically make a proposal. And he took it to the Melkite Synod of Bishops. And he wanted them to vote on it as a church. So in 1995, the Melkite Synod, after an overwhelming majority vote, I think there are 28 bishops present, and I think 24 or 26 voted in favor of it. They passed this initiative as something they wanted to pursue. And then they presented it to the Melkite Patriarch. At the same time, Archbishop Elias had a friend who was an archbishop in the Greek Orthodox Church who liked the idea, and he took the proposal to the Antiochian Orthodox Patriarch to try and advocate it on that side. So the Melkite Church was, for the most part, supportive of the idea, and there were some people in the Orthodox Church who were, but almost immediately the Orthodox Church rejected it. Very quickly, they rejected it. And their reason for rejecting it was this. They believe that unity of faith must precede intercommunion. They feel you cannot share communion until the faith is the same. So they rejected it outright pretty quickly. They actually had an emergency synod meeting to reject it, to discuss it and ultimately reject it. So it didn't get much traction. It was shot down immediately by the Orthodox. On the Catholic side, the Vatican really didn't do anything at first. They just kind of watched to see what would happen. And when it became clear that the Orthodox rejected it, about 2 years later, Pope John Paul II wanted to offer some suggestions and feedback on it. So he asked 3 cardinals from 3 different Vatican offices to write something up addressing this. So the lead writer was Cardinal Ratzinger, who wanted to be Pope Benedict, representing the CDF. But also there was the head of the Congregation for the Eastern Churches, Cardinal Silvestrini, and then also the head of the Congregation for Promoting Christian Unity, who was Cardinal Cassidy at the time. So the 3 of them wrote this document at the request of Pope John Paul II. And if you read the document, it was a letter written to the Melkite Patriarch, and it's very friendly, very nice, very kind. And it actually commends what they were trying to do, but it notes that it was rejected by the Orthodox, and they offer some feedback on why it probably failed and how other efforts could be made in the future that would be more successful. So that's kind of the Vatican response. The Vatican never repudiated or rejected it. They just kind of watched what happened and then offered some feedback on it.
You think that it might be open to it in the future?
If this kind of thing were to happen and there was a positive reception on the Orthodox side, I could see the Vatican not necessarily being opposed to it under certain conditions. I think the actual proposals, there were 2 items in the Melkite Zogby Initiative. And the items themselves are a little bit problematic because they're extremely vague. And the Vatican document noted that. It said these 2 propositions can be interpreted in many different ways.
Right.
Also, it said that in the Vatican response, they said that they felt it was important that the larger bodies be included in any kind of initiative. If you just take 2 smaller bodies like the Antiochian Orthodox and the Melkite Catholics, but you leave out the broader communions they're a part of, they felt that was not productive and could even be harmful under certain circumstances. So I think if the 2 items were significantly clarified, and I have suggestions for clarifying them, and if the broader communions of both the Orthodox and the Catholics were involved, could this be successful in the future? Not likely, but anything is possible.
I mean, if the broader communions were involved and came on board, it sounds like we would already have reunion anyway. So
yeah, we wouldn't
be talking about a partial communion at that point anyway.
Right.
What were the 2 items that he presented?
Right. If you could put up on the screen, it's helpful to actually see them because the language is very important. So there are 2 propositions. And what this was a profession of faith that the churches would adopt as a way of creating this double communion. So the first item, I believe everything which Eastern Orthodoxy teaches.
Mhm.
That's the first proposition. And the second proposition is this: I am in communion with the Bishop of Rome as the first among the bishops, according to the limits recognized by the Holy Fathers of the East during the first millennium before the separation.
Mhm.
So those are two items. Again, the first one, I believe everything which Eastern Orthodoxy teaches. And secondly, I am in communion with Rome as recognized in the first millennium.
Mhm.
Um, Now, the criticism from both the Orthodox and the Catholics was that these were very vague propositions that could be
Sure.
interpreted in many different ways.
Oh, yeah.
And again, that was intentional.
Yeah.
He purposely left it vague because he was trying to spark a conversation and
Sure.
maybe move the ball forward a bit. So he left them vague enough that both sides could interpret it differently, hoping it would kind of break the logjam, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, because I could, in a sense, say those things. But then there's a different sense in which an Eastern Orthodox could also affirm those things. But
Right.
we would probably mean different things by them. And so that's the issue. Um, yeah, so it doesn't really resolve a whole lot. It
No.
seems to, in fact, capitalize on ambiguity intentionally.
Yes. Yes. And again, he liked to provoke things for good reason. He was trying to get past the impasse that we seem stuck at, so he purposely tried to provoke things.
Well, I can certainly appreciate wanting to stir the waters to bring about greater communion.
You've been known to stir the waters yourself, Michael.
Yeah, a little bit. But I am concerned about some of the theological positions he took. And they are positions that I continue to see being presented by some Eastern Catholics, especially online today, that is just very troubling, and does not seem right at all. Um, let's maybe explore some of those if you want to move beyond the initiative into maybe some of those, unless you had anything else you wanted to touch on.
I really want to first say a few things about the initiative itself, the two
Let's do
items.
it.
So the first point, I believe everything which Eastern Orthodoxy teaches.
Mhm.
Well, the problem with that is, what does Eastern Orthodoxy teach?
Right.
That is the question,
Sure.
because within the Orthodox churches themselves, there's some disputes.
Sure.
Things such as, is there grace in the Catholic Church?
Yep.
Some Orthodox would teach that our sacraments are valid. Others would say that we are heretics with no validity whatsoever, and that we worship bread.
Yeah.
You can find both opinions online in abundance.
Mhm.
So what does that even mean? What does Orthodoxy teach? There are certain things that are pretty universal, but there are a lot of big questions that Orthodoxy cannot address.
Mhm.
And part of that is because Orthodoxy itself, at its root, the belief is that the highest authority is an ecumenical council, but they're not capable of calling an ecumenical council. So that leaves things kind of stuck in limbo, frozen in a sense. So what does Orthodoxy teach? Now, in some of his other writings, Archbishop Elias offered a bit more clarity on this. He wrote several other books related to this topic. And one thing that he said was, in his perspective, being in communion with Rome is part of the Eastern tradition. Because if you look at Christianity during the first millennium, being in communion with Rome was seen as an important thing, a very significant thing. So in his viewpoint, part of the Eastern tradition being lived fully is being in communion with Rome. So in that respect, he believed that the Orthodox Church didn't fully represent the Eastern tradition because it lacked the communion with Rome. That's why he himself never broke communion with Rome. He was very happy to be in communion with Rome. He believed it was important. The second point, though, I am in communion with the Bishop of Rome as the first among the bishops, according to the limits recognized by the Holy Fathers of the East during the first millennium before the separation. And again, there you may have some argument as to what that actually means. You'll find some Orthodox historians or polemicists who will argue that the Bishop of Rome had no authority during the first millennium. And you'll find others who recognize that he did. And, the Catholic historians would say the Bishop of Rome played a very significant role during the first millennium. So there's dispute there as to what that even means. One thing to recognize, though, is when he talks about the limits of the first millennium, what he's referring to there is how during the first millennium, the Roman Church showed great respect and deference towards the prerogatives of the Eastern Patriarchates. And he saw firsthand as a Melkite archbishop that in his time period, that respect did not exist towards the Eastern Catholics. He had a real problem with the way the Vatican was functioning towards Eastern Catholics at that time, because it was very heavy-handed, very heavy-handed. You had the Congregation for the Eastern Churches, which can serve a valuable purpose. It can actually help Eastern churches to reclaim their patrimony, but at times it can be really overbearing as well. And he felt that if there's going to be reunion between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, the Catholic side needs to begin treating the Eastern Catholics how the Orthodox could expect to be treated. So he had a problem with that. So he's emphasizing those limits for a reason.
That helps make sense of the emphasis, although I do have concerns about the theological position that it seems that he adopted in those areas.
And the Vatican letter that came 2 years later mentioned that. And it mentioned that there has been a development in doctrine in Catholicism regarding the understanding of the papacy. And that, that development, you can see the very beginning of the church, and over the centuries, it has developed further. And what they say in the letter is important, that in any genuine dialogue, we have to recognize that development of doctrine, and we can't just ignore it and sweep it under the table. We have to accept that there has been a development, but at the same time, we can talk about how can the papal primacy be exercised in a new way? How can it be exercised in a different way? And we see that in the letter, to the letter responding to the initiative, that is open for discussion, that can be discussed. But at the same time, they can't just ignore the doctrines that developed.
Yeah, that's definitely helpful. I don't know if you are familiar with this. If you've seen it, you probably have, I imagine. Have you seen the website, the Melkite website, melkite.org, where they have a section called "What is your view of Archbishop Zogby's book? We're all schismatics." Have you seen that before?
Yes, I think it was Bishop John responded to it. Yeah,
that's right. Which I found fascinating and very helpful, because it touches on a lot of issues that I just continue to see circulated in Eastern Orthodoxy. I said Eastern Orthodoxy. No, in some quarters of Eastern Catholicism today, I see some of these views asserted there, and oddly enough, they are also asserted in Eastern Orthodoxy. I don't want to jump the gun too far, but yeah, this is something that I see, and it seems to be doctrinally problematic. However, Bishop John, in his response here, I thought offered a really good reply, and I want to explore some of that. If you're ready to move on from the initiative to this, let's talk a little bit.
But later on, I'd like to circle back and explain how I'd fix those 2 points.
Okay, absolutely. So let's maybe talk a little bit about the book, which has been translated as "We Are All Schismatics," but written by Zogby. But originally, in its original language, it was something more to the effect of "Are we all schismatics?" ?
Yes.
And so it wasn't a statement; rather, it was a question.
It was written in French, and the title was a question.
Yeah, whereas in English, it's unfortunate because it puts it as an assertion, "We are all schismatics," which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And in it, I see some things expressed that are deeply troubling to me, because again, I continue to see them recurring in some Eastern Catholic circles, and I have to be frank that it really seems heterodox in nature.
Well, I think he wanted to evoke a response. He actually described it himself as a shock book. He called it a shock book, is what he said. It was meant to shock people.
I don't know if it was meant to shock people in a different way, but it certainly can be shocking from unorthodox perspective, in my opinion, with all due respect to the Archbishop. Let me maybe start to dive into some of these examples that they explore in this article, which I'll put a link to in the show notes so that everybody can check it out, because it's right there on the melkite.org website. Again, I found it to be very helpful.
It's a very good response, very balanced.
Mm-hmm. It really is. It really is. So it says this quote of the Archbishop. He asserts that the councils held by the West alone cannot be considered ecumenical because they did not include the Eastern Orthodox patriarchates, end quote. I hear this often. I hear it expressed by some Eastern Catholics, and I have a number of problems with it. Number one, it seems a little silly, aside because there are instances, even with the first 7 ecumenical councils, where you don't have representation from all the patriarchates. The second ecumenical council had 0 representation from Rome. 0. Now, obviously, it's received later on by Rome, but it had no representation. And yet, it was still considered ecumenical in nature. And, there's other examples as well. So I kind of thought that that's a odd thing to express, given that I think it would knock out some of the first 7 ecumenical councils from among the list of ecumenical.
That reasoning for them not being ecumenical, I agree, is very flawed. Very flawed. The idea, though, of referring to the later councils by different terminology, that really kind of begins with Pope Paul VI.
Mm-hmm.
He, at least in one place, referred to the councils after the schism as being the general councils of the West. That was the language he used. And again, that was during a period in which in the air was a sense of imminent reunion.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he was trying to make things as easy as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can all agree, Catholic and Orthodox alike, that those first 7 councils have a special precedence.
Sure.
Nothing that came later reaches the same level of authority that those first 7 does, in the sense that those were the ones that really kind of laid the foundations of the faith. So is it possible for the church to use words other than ecumenical councils to describe the latter ones? Maybe the church can change the terminology or put an asterisk next to the term ecumenical to emphasize the first 7 are of greater priority. But at the same time, you can't just claim that they're meaningless and can be brushed under the rug either.
Yeah, because some people said they're just merely local councils for the West. And I think that's where one goes too far, because I don't have an issue with somebody saying there's priority to the first 7 councils and that maybe we're going to use a particular designation for those as opposed to subsequent ones. I don't have an issue with that. Here's where my issue is when we downgrade them to local councils of the West. Here's why that's the problem. It assumes that the College of Bishops no longer exists after the schism, which is absurd, because the College of Bishops is something that is apostolic in nature, and it's a divine institution. It's of divine origin. So it can't just all of a sudden be snuffed out because of a schism. But you would have to say, well, the College of Bishops just doesn't exist after the schism in order to take that position. The College of Bishops being the full body of bishops, universal. And when I look at Trent, Vatican I, Vatican II, it's very clear the College of Bishops in its full capacity is functioning. So I think we end up encroaching into really heterodox positions when we start to downgrade these to local ecumenical councils. Local councils that are not universal in nature and not the full College of Bishops and an act of the College of Bishops. Because we would then also have to say all of those teachings that we thought were infallible in nature are in fact not infallible. They're just non-definitive teachings. Right. I think it just does a disaster to ecclesiology and the magisterium that is really irreversible at that point.
So the problem is fundamentally this. Christ says to Peter that you are Peter, upon this rock I will build my church. Mm-hmm. The gates of hell, the gates of the underworld will not ever triumph against it. Mm-hmm. So we have a promise from Christ that the church will always be there. The gates of hell will never triumph against it. And, Christ said he came to build a church, to establish a church. So this church was meant to be a teacher, a guide. So when Christ left, when Christ went to be physically in heaven, he didn't leave us here lost without a guide. he left the church to be our mother and teacher, so we would have a lamppost to follow.
Mm-hmm.
If you say that after 1054, the church was incapable of teaching with authority, at that point, where is the guide? Where is the mother? Where is the lamppost? At that point, it's almost as if the gates of hell have triumphed because the church is incapable of teaching. Because the world is always changing. New challenges are developing all the time. And the church has to be able to respond to those with authority. If it can't do so because it cannot call a council, an ecumenical council with authority, at that point, the teacher is lost or is basically a hologram speaking from the past.
Yeah, this is why I just think it does irreparable damage at that point. And, so but I don't know if people who buy into this stuff, and I hear some Eastern Catholics who buy into it, I don't know if they've really thought through it and the implications of what they're saying here.
So there are a number of Eastern Catholics who buy into this. And in fairness to Archbishop Elias, again, he wrote other things other than that one book in which he was much clearer about his reasons for remaining Catholic. And he had reasons. He felt that communion with Rome was part of what it meant to be fully Eastern. He believed that.
Mm-hmm.
The people who take the position that the later councils are meaningless or have no significance to the greater church, I think very often they're uncritically buying into perhaps the Anglican branch theory.
Mm-hmm.
That the church
or just buying into what they hear from Eastern Orthodox.
Well, not even that, because you'll find Orthodox who say that, but typically they're coming from a different place theologically. The Eastern Catholics who say that typically are coming from the place where the Christian church was shattered in half. You have the Western, the Catholic half, and then you have the Eastern Orthodox half, but the church is not united. The church has been torn asunder and needs to be put back together. We're trying to repair Humpty Dumpty. And that really comes from ecclesiology-wise, the Anglican branch theory. The Anglicans had this theory that the Christian church, the Catholic church, was divided up. It had to be reassembled. Now, the Catholic Church does not believe that. The Catholic Church teaches that it is the Catholic Church. And other bodies may be out of communion with the Catholic Church, but the church itself is still intact. Even if some of those bodies are very close to us and are even mystically connected to us, the church itself still maintains its authority as one. So the Eastern Catholics who buy into that, they may be parroting what the Orthodox say, but if you follow their logic, it really is the Anglican branch theory, where the Orthodox who say that, they're not coming from that perspective. They're typically coming from the perspective that they are the church. They are the one church. We're outside of it.
It just seems odd, too, that an Eastern Catholic would espouse these things, because I think if they carried it to their logical conclusion, they would go to Eastern Orthodoxy and wouldn't waste their time with Eastern Catholicism, which ironically might be why you start to see Eastern Catholics doing this very thing and going to Orthodoxy.
Eastern Catholics who espouse those viewpoints to that extreme typically do not stick around.
Yeah.
Usually they'll be Eastern
Why
Catholics
would you?
for a few years and then leave.
Yeah, why would you? Also, I find it interesting. I heard Father Kappas say it now and went and verified it. In fact, I did a whole show on it, demonstrating it from the primary sources of Vatican II. The Eastern Catholic churches at Vatican II accepted, quote, 21 ecumenical councils, end quote. 21.
Yes.
And they call them ecumenical. Now, again, these are the Eastern Catholic churches represented at Vatican II. So I think one is not in line with their own church as an Eastern Catholic whenever they say this.
So at Vatican II, again, Archbishop Elias had tremendous influence. And he actually, at one point, stated that there only were 7 ecumenical councils, and the later councils were not ecumenical. And when he said that, the Melkite Patriarch made his own statement clarifying that he was speaking for himself and not for the Melkite Church.
Yeah. And then, again, the other representation there from the Eastern Catholics also accepted it. So I think it's an untenable position theologically and just practically.
I think I see what he was getting at, which was there needs to be maybe a clarification about priority. But
I'm
again,
fine with that.
The way
That's
it's
fine.
stated and the way it's usually understood, it becomes the Anglican branch theory.
I don't have a problem with somebody saying that the first 7 have priority. I don't have an issue with that. That's fine. Unfortunately, people go further than that. Here's another thing that comes from the article that I mentioned here. It says, quote, he, that is of Zogby, he claims that the union which took place between some Eastern churches with Rome in the past 3 centuries was a great mistake, end quote. I often see this kind of self-loathing and self-hatred among some Eastern Catholics, and I'm really mystified by it. Again, if one really believes this, I don't understand why they remain Catholic. Now, I understand that Zogby retained communion with Rome and says that he has reasons for it, but if it's a mistake, it just seems self-contradictory. What are your thoughts here?
Right. So, I've read the book. I have it here
Mhm.
with me.
Mhm.
And in the book, he's coming from a very negative perspective. It's almost a perspective where he's been very soured on things. And the time in which he's writing it, I believe he wrote in 1998, he was feeling increasingly smothered by Roman bureaucracy.
Mhm.
The Vatican Curia was really kind of being oppressive towards some of the Eastern churches.
Mhm.
And he's coming from a place perhaps of sadness and frustration. So he
Mhm.
was very much writing out of sadness and frustration in some of the sections of the book. He expresses a very negative view of how they were treated. So on one hand, he says in other writings that to have the fullness of the Eastern tradition, you need communion with Rome. But he also says that the Eastern Catholics do not represent the fullness of the Eastern tradition
Mhm.
because of the way we're treated by Rome. Because the fullness of the Eastern tradition involves a certain level of respect for the Eastern patrimony and its way of doing things. And at that time, he felt that Rome was extremely overbearing and treating the Eastern Catholic churches like little children.
Mhm.
So he's writing from a place of frustration. That's why that particular book, Are We All Schismatics, or We Are All Schismatics, depending on the translation, that's why that particular book is not something I recommend new Eastern Catholics read. Somebody who's been Eastern Catholic for a long time and understands the history and the theology, if they want to read it for historical reasons, great. I've lent it to people with the stipulation that they understand he's coming from a place of frustration during a very different time. Things are very different now for Eastern Catholics, much, much better. I've seen situations where brand new Eastern Catholics read that book and they start feeling his frustration and end up leaving. So that book is not necessarily helpful to somebody who's very new to Eastern Catholicism, but for somebody who's been around for a while, wants to know the history and is considering the issues, it can be, worth reading.
Yeah, that's helpful. Here's another one. Quote, he, that is Zogby, recognizes the primacy, but only of honor to the Church of Rome, end quote. Now, I have to be blunt here. That position is heretical. It is impossible to maintain that. At least I don't see any other way. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but I do not see how that is consistent with Catholic dogma. I don't see how that's consistent with the Sixth Ecumenical Council. So let's just table the second millennium. I don't think that's consistent with the first millennium. And these 7 ecumenical councils that we're given priority to, that's not consistent with the Sixth Council or the Seventh Ecumenical Council. To speak of honor only, as Eastern Orthodox theologians will rightly point out, I think Schmemann is one of them, it's meaningless to speak of a primacy of honor. It's really meaningless because what does that really mean? You can't really get a straight answer. And then number 2, you see something much more than a primacy of honor, whatever that may mean. There's something way more than that in the authority that the Bishop of Rome has in the first millennium.
So, first of all, a disclaimer. It's been many years since I've delved deep into the history of this.
Sure.
But when I was delving deep, I was trying to figure out where these terms came from. Where did this
Okay.
expression primacy of honor come from? And what I found kind of shocked me, which was the term primacy of honor. I forget when it originated,
Mhm.
but it doesn't mean the same thing that is interpreted as meaning today.
Okay.
So originally, when there was talk of a primacy of honor, it didn't mean a primacy with no authority. It meant a primacy that included some level of authority. What that is perhaps debatable, but the idea of honor, as it was originally used when that term originated, actually did involve authority above other bishops, at least at some level of leadership, more than just he has the best seat at the table, right? What's happened is today, when you hear the term primacy of honor, Orthodox apologists and those who use it typically mean it's a primacy in which he has no authority whatsoever and he's no more important than any other bishop. But historically, the term primacy of honor entailed a whole lot more than that.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's helpful. If there is something else meant by that than the way it's typically used today, that could be a helpful explanation then. Let's explore this next one here. The article also says, quote, he calls for the double communion of the Melkite Church, both with Rome and with the Orthodox churches, end quote. And that's the Zogby Initiative that we've been describing here. And there is a comment here that's also made on the article about it. He claims, quote, the Orthodox patriarchs and bishops are the only legitimate successors of the apostles over the Eastern sees under the claim that they represent the authentic Eastern tradition, end quote. So in other words, the Eastern Catholics, as you kind of alluded to earlier, from his perspective, don't really represent the fullness of the Eastern tradition, but rather the Eastern Orthodox do, and they're the legitimate successors. So the Eastern Catholic bishops, they're not really legitimate successors of the apostles in the Eastern sees, but rather the Eastern Orthodox are. Do you have any comments on that? Any opinions?
Yes. Again, if you look at some of his other writings, the context is a bit different. So he's saying that the Eastern Catholic churches as they exist don't represent what Eastern Christianity in its fullness is meant to be. And by that, he means treated like children with no rights, no ability to even govern themselves, being told what to do by an Italian cardinal in Rome. And I say that as a proud Italian, right? You know, somebody named Silvestrini probably shouldn't be telling the Melkites what to do. Right. Yeah. So he's coming from that perspective on it. But like I said elsewhere, he affirms his communion with Rome and the reasons why. So he's not saying that the Orthodox are the legitimate, fullness of the Eastern tradition, because again, he says elsewhere that they're lacking communion with Rome, which is part of the Eastern tradition. But I think, again, he's coming from a place of frustration with how he sees Eastern Catholicism being lived out. And he's speaking from his own experience as a Melkite. The idea of dual communion, that was his house growing up, right? His family was dual communion, right? They were both Melkite and Antiochian Orthodox, and they didn't think too much of it. The differences didn't seem that significant to them. So really, in a sense, he's taking his own family lived experience and trying to propose it on a wider level. But he's also coming from the perspective of the history of the Melkite Church. And the Melkite Church's split from the Antiochian Orthodox Church was very late, again, 18th century, much later than the other churches. And it was a situation where historically one could make the case that the Antiochian Orthodox represent the older line of the see of Antioch, and that the Melkites at least factually broke away from them to establish communion with Rome. So he's coming from it from that angle. I think he's ignoring the fact, though, or not thinking about the experience of other Eastern Catholic churches. For instance, and again, this is controversial, but one can make a pretty strong case that the original Church of Kiev is today the Ukrainian Catholic Church. One can make that case. I've read books arguing that. Now, I've seen Orthodox people who go berserk when I say that. And again, I'm not saying that's definitive, but I have a book that I've read on the history of the situation from a scholarly perspective. And it seems pretty clear to many people, to many historians, that the Church of Kiev, almost as a whole, came into communion with Rome. And that the Orthodox churches that came later in Ukraine are actually the newcomers in a sense. So I think he's not thinking about the larger Eastern Catholic experience, but he's focusing primarily on the Melkite experience. And I think that's unfortunate.
Yeah, that's helpful. Very, very helpful. Here's a response that they include on the article to what Zogby is saying here. And this is a response from Zogby's successor, Cyril Boustros. Quote, we deduce from it that the Greek Orthodox, because of their refusal of communion with Rome, regardless of the reasons for this refusal, do not represent the Eastern tradition, but partially, because the complete Eastern tradition requires absolutely the communion with Rome, although in a special way, as it was in the first millennium, end quote. So, in other words, the response that Archbishop Cyril offers to his predecessor is that ultimately it's the Eastern Orthodox that are lacking something essential, and that is communion with the Bishop of Rome, and that is essential to Eastern patrimony. Well, did you have any final remarks here? I know you said you wanted to circle back to some of this before we ended. Yeah, if you want.
The two propositions at the heart of the initiative.
Mm-hmm.
I've toyed with the idea of how could they be fixed from a Catholic perspective. And again, I know what he was trying to do. He purposely kept them vague enough to create a stir. But I think they could be fixed in a way that'd be in harmony with Catholicism. So the first one, if you could put them back up on the screen, the first one.
Sure.
I believe everything which Eastern Orthodoxy teaches. Okay, so that's the first one. I'll tell you how I personally would fix it. What I would do is I would change the wording a bit. So it goes as follows. I believe everything which Eastern Orthodoxy historically teaches, but not later viewpoints that are reactions developed in opposition to Catholicism.
Well said. Well said.
Because today, a lot of what passes for Orthodox belief, Orthodox doctrine, does not represent what Orthodoxy taught during the first millennium.
Right.
A lot of it is reactionary viewpoints that were created against Catholicism many centuries later. So if we're looking at what Orthodoxy really teaches, I say look at what it taught during the first millennium, not what it taught in reaction to papal proclamations.
Sure. Yeah.
I would fix the first one in that way. Now, the second one, here's how I would go about fixing it. I am in communion with the Bishop of Rome as the first among the bishops, according to the limits recognized by the Holy Fathers of the East during the first millennium, before the separation, while recognizing the legitimate development of Catholic doctrine and papal primacy, and not considering later developments as heretical.
Yeah.
I think that fixes it pretty simply.
Yeah.
From a Catholic perspective.
But as you noted, I mean, I think he was intentionally trying to capitalize on ambiguity, which is not something foreign to our tradition in East and West. Some of the councils in the first millennium kind of did this. And so
there's something in his writings too, that a lot of the Eastern Catholics who follow his perspective miss. So I've encountered a lot of Catholics online, Eastern Catholics, who read his books, but they miss the bigger picture. And they're very much focused on, again, what I would say this Anglican branch theory.
Yeah.
What is that? But if you actually read what he's writing, his other books, his other articles, what he keeps coming back to is the idea of metanoia, repentance. He really believes that on both sides, Catholics and Orthodox need to repent for the continuing division, and we didn't make healing it a matter of urgency. He feels that very strongly. And again, this is a guy who was dragged off and arrested by the Egyptian government. This is a guy who was captured and held hostage by Islamic terrorists. If nothing else, he was a brave person who was persecuted for his faith. He was, in a sense, a confessor. So he sees the urgency of this. For him, this was a very urgent thing. And the fact the rest of us are sitting around today, even typing at each other nasty things on the internet, he would see that as a scandal for which we need to repent. And I think there's a certain importance in that urgency. Metanoia is the key. We have to repent.
Well said. Well said. I wholeheartedly agree. Here's something from Father Brown. I really want to hear specific examples of ways the Eastern Catholics get ignored or Latinized. I want to make sure I'm sensitive to these. Any examples?
Yeah. Now, again, today things are so much better than they were, so much
Sure.
better. But there was a period of time in which Eastern Catholic traditions or practices were minimized.
Hmm.
So the most famous example was in North America. The whole situation where back in the 1800s and the early 1900s, the Roman Catholic bishops in America were scandalized that there were married Eastern Catholic priests, and they petitioned Rome demanding that Eastern Catholic priests in North America must be celibate. And that created a ban. Rome obliged them and created this law that effectively stopped Eastern Catholics from ordaining married men. It was on the books up until, I want to say 2013, 2014, even though it was ignored in some places before then. So that was one of the big issues. And in my experience, that created a lot of what I call bitter Byzantines. And the reason Eastern Catholics were bitter about this, especially in North America, wasn't just that our tradition was disrespected. It was disrespected, but because it led to real damage. So in our tradition, you typically have married priests in parishes with families, and then you have strong monasteries. And the monasteries are kind of like the spiritual battery that the church is built around. Well, when you make it so that all the celibate clergy must be priests in parishes, the monasteries don't take on the same character if they even exist. So monasticism in North America among the Eastern Catholics never took off, in large part because of that. So we lost a huge part of our tradition there. But also because of that particular ruling, a lot of families were split. A lot of Eastern Catholics became Orthodox when this first happened in the 1890s and again in the 1920s or 30s. And families were split down the middle. It created a lot of conflict, a lot of division. And it caused us to have a massive clergy shortage, which we probably wouldn't have had. So parishes were shutting down. It just created so many problems. And the fact that this was on the books until 2014 was kind of ridiculous. That's a very concrete example. But, other things on a more practical level, well, here's a situation that comes up all the time. And I want to thank you, by the way, Father Brown, for being sensitive to this. I've seen your post on Facebook, by the way, and I really appreciate your perspective. So in Eastern Catholicism, our children are initiated as babies, and they receive, baptism, confirmation, we call it chrismation, and then they receive their first communion as infants, and they receive communion as babies, and they receive every week for the rest of their lives. Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes you have situations where Eastern Catholics don't live near a parish, or for a period of time they're far away from an Eastern Catholic parish, so they'll go to a Latin parish. And typically what will happen is the Eastern Catholics will go to the Roman Catholic priest and say, hey, we're going to be here for a while or indefinitely. These are our kids. They've been initiated. Can they receive communion on Sundays? Now, from what I've heard, the majority of Roman Catholic priests will say, sure, and they'll educate the parish as to what's going on. Why are these particular kids receiving communion? It's a great opportunity to teach the parish. But there have been some cases in which the priest will say no, because that would scandalize our parishioners.
I've gone through that.
You've experienced that. Yeah.
Yep.
And that is a huge problem.
Because it's itself scandalous.
It is.
So my son, who has been fully initiated, in some Roman Rite churches, can't receive communion. It just doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't, and that's a problem. Again, those type of situations for Roman Catholics is an opportunity to educate people.
Sure. Yeah. There is and by the way, were there any Latinization examples that you could think of?
So Latinizations, when we talk about Latinization, we're referring to Western practices that are imposed upon the East in the sense that they take away legitimate Eastern practices. So what would be an example of that? Well, among Ukrainian Catholics, especially in North America, there was a tendency to get rid of the sung divine liturgies and to do everything recited. Now, like most Latinizations, that did not come from Rome. That came from Eastern Catholics who were mimicking Western practices. Interestingly enough, on matters of liturgy, Rome has been very much adamant about Eastern Catholics maintaining their Eastern traditions. That's been a big thing. But most Latinizations came from the Eastern Catholics themselves, mimicking the larger Western Church. So you had situations where there are Eastern Catholic parishes where they'd stop singing, everything would be recited. They'd get rid of the icon screens, there'd be no icons. Maybe they'd put statues in the church instead of icons. Things of that nature. And that is problematic. Those are Latinizations. But again, the Latinizations are usually coming from the Eastern Catholics themselves, usually in defiance of Rome.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, there was a big situation recently. I want to say it was a Syro-Malabar church. I believe it was, but don't quote me on that. I believe it was a Syro-Malabar church where they had a situation where at a certain point in their parishes, the priests began facing the people as opposed to facing east. Now, in the Eastern tradition, we faced ad orientem during worship. We're all facing God together. But what happened was again, I believe it was a Syro-Malabar church. In the Syro-Malabar church, they saw that the Roman Catholics were all facing the people, so they began just doing the same thing. And that was a Latinization that came into that church after Vatican II. Now, here's what happened. Younger Syro-Malabar priests, and again, if I'm mistaken, forgive me, but I believe it was them. Younger Syro-Malabar priests tend to be much more traditional, kind of like younger Roman Catholic priests tend to be much more traditional. And they wanted to go back to the original Eastern practice of facing east. And some of the bishops and some of the older clergy resisted this. They felt that, the reforms of Vatican II were important, even though Vatican II actually called for us to be more traditional. And they were going against the tradition by facing the people. And this got to be a big problem. And at a certain point, the synod of that church appealed to the Pope and asked him to intervene. They wanted him to intervene because they came up with a solution, which was during part of the liturgy, I guess we would call the liturgy of the word, the priest would face the people, and then for the liturgy of the Eucharist, again, there's a different term for it in the East. During that part, everyone would face east together at Orientem. And, that's a reasonable compromise. But there were some older bishops in the synod who were really upset about this because they had that mindset that the priest must face the people. And because they were still on the synod, involved in the synod, they still had some say, and they were causing this problem to get even worse and worse and worse. So they asked the Pope to intervene. And they asked the Pope to change the law, the canon law of their church. Strange, right, for an Eastern church to ask Rome to intervene and change their canon law, but they were at an impasse. They needed a solution. So Rome intervened, and Rome came up with the rule that at a certain age, retired bishops in that church no longer are voting members of the synod. And when they did that, that enabled the younger bishops to move things forward and restore some level of peace to the church. That hasn't been restored yet, hopefully. I haven't been following it carefully. But that was a situation where Roman intervention actually helped a lot.
This is one final question I wanted to pull up here for you. From City of the Immaculata, maybe $1 million question, but is there any way to get East and West reunion without causing a series of massive schisms in the process and fixing one fissure? We always cause 20 others. I think this is a massive problem because I look, if let's say the Patriarch of Constantinople wants to go into communion with Rome, let's say we have that right now. Well, there's going to be plenty of Orthodox who break away with him, and they'll just replace him with another Patriarch of Constantinople.
Exactly. And then, what would happen is a century later, people will be talking about the fake Uniate Patriarch of Constantinople,
exactly,
as opposed to the true Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople.
Yep.
That's the problem. That's what happened in Ukraine. After the Union of Brest, they brought in new Orthodox bishops to replace the ones that became Catholic. And then eventually the Catholic ones were seen as the imposters, even though they were actually the ones following the original line. So unfortunately, the only way this could work is if the majority came in at once. If the majority came in at once, it'd be pretty hard to claim that they were union imposters. Is that possible? Maybe, maybe not. But even if that happened, there'd be a group who broke off who would claim to be the true Orthodox churches.
Right.
And
well, any concluding remarks before we depart here?
I think we touched upon the main things. You know, again, as we said earlier, Archbishop Elias was a controversial guy. He purposely wanted to be controversial. Whether he went too far or not is debatable. But at the same time, we have to respect the fact that he was trying to get people out of complacency. And I think today complacency is a huge problem.
Oh, absolutely. Well said. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this and explaining this very complex discussion to us. This was incredibly helpful. I enjoyed it. Put in a plug for your blog, by the way.
Yeah, I have a website called East to West, from East to West. The website is EAST2west.org, east2west.org. There I have a Q&A about Eastern Catholicism, and I also have videos and stuff on there as well. So check it out if you get a chance.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed this video with Father Deacon Anthony Dragani where we discussed the Zogby Initiative. I hope you found it beneficial and that it shed light on what exactly it is, what are some good aspects to it, and maybe what are some criticisms that can be offered in relation to the discussion of reunion with the Eastern Orthodox. Thanks for watching. Hit the like button and the subscribe button. God bless.